1,000 songs. And it goes right in my pocket.
Failure of the future has to be a nation that is agile, that is innovative, that is creative.
Innovation. Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about innovation in the enterprise, brought to you and run by Collective Campus, an innovation hub based in Australia that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies and tools to successfully explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. For more information, go to www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast.
Welcome back to Future Squared, everyone. Today I'll be speaking with Brian Christian. He's the author of The Most Human Human, which was named a Wall Street Journal bestseller and a New Yorker favorite book of 2011. The Most Human Human is a provocative, exuberant, and profound exploration of the ways in which computers are reshaping our ideas of what it means to be human. He's just released his latest book, Algorithms to Live By, co-written with cognitive scientist Tom Griffiths. The book offers a fascinating exploration of how computer algorithms can be applied to our everyday lives, helping to solve common decision-making problems and illuminate the workings of the human mind. Christian's writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Wired, The Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, The Paris Review, and in scientific journals such as Cognitive Science. Christian has been featured on The Charlie Rose Show and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Christian has also lectured at Google, Microsoft, the Santa Fe Institute, and the London School of Economics. So with that, I bring you the one, the only, Brian Christian. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, and you're joining us from San Francisco?
Yes, that's correct.
Fantastic. You, however, were a native of Delaware growing up, is that right?
I was born in Wilmington, Delaware, but I actually spent most of my childhood in New Jersey, in Monmouth County, New Jersey, which is just the next state over.
Yeah, and you've made the trek west. Is that a recent move, or did you do that a few years back?
I've made several treks west and then followed by treks back east. So I originally went to Seattle for graduate school at the University of Washington, and then moved to Philadelphia back on the East Coast, where I'm from originally, and then in 2012 moved into the Bay Area, which is where I still am now.
Oh, fantastic. And look, I'm really excited to talk to you today, Brian, particularly around AI, which is a topic very close to your heart and your line of work. And, in 2009, you were chosen to participate in the annual Turing test, which pits artificial intelligence programs against people to determine whether or not people can actually think, whether or not computers can actually think, rather. And, you set out to make sure that the Homo sapiens would prevail.
Yes.
And you earned the title of the most human human as a result. So in 2014, though, thanks to Moore's Law, exponential growth, the AI computer program, Eugene Guzman, finally passed the Turing test. Should we be concerned?
In a word, we should probably be just as concerned as we hopefully already were in 2009. But I think, I think it's remarkable to watch the progress, not even in the Turing test itself, but just in the industry at large. There's sort of this interesting paradox, actually, if you look at the results of the annual Turing test, where the chatbots don't appear to be getting markedly stronger, and yet every year chatbot technology becomes more and more a part of commerce, industry, customer service, etc. And part of the reason for this is that the monetary prize on offer at the annual Turing test competition is only several $1,000s. And so what happens is once someone starts to make a real breakthrough, they basically get snatched up by the industry and they end up working at places like Apple and Google and Microsoft. And doing work there that has more of a commercial orientation. And so I think for people on the outside looking at the annual state of the art as it's represented in the Loebner Prize competition, things might appear to be more static than in fact they actually are. And so what we're seeing right now is just this huge move into everyday life, where interacting with a chatbot, interacting with a service that may be a human, may be a chatbot, is deliberately ambiguous. This is just becoming part of how we use technology.
And many people don't even realize that things like Siri, everyday things that people take for granted are a form of AI.
Right, exactly. And so, we're getting more and more used to the idea of, a conversational agent as a normal way of interacting with a computer or a corporation even. And so I really do think that we're going to see, what we're seeing right now is just the beginning of a much larger shift. I mean, I know for sure there are teams within Google, within Facebook, within Microsoft that are looking to interactive, text chatbots as in some sense the next big revolution in user interface. So if you're Google, for example, one of the things that would be a huge threat to your bottom line would be some upheaval in user interface such that people aren't navigating to a website and typing a string of words into the search box. And so chatbots, from this perspective, represent, a major threat to the advertising model that Google makes 90% of their revenue from. Yeah. And so the way to get ahead of that curve is for them to themselves be at the forefront of chatbot research and trying to figure out how to make that work for them. And so this is very much on the minds of the big tech companies right now.
Yeah. It's quite interesting. I mean, these companies who we have, I suppose, who have become synonymous with technology, with disruptive innovation, they themselves now, facing the dilemma of how do we catch that next S-curve before everyone else does.
Right.
Because their existing business models, as you've correctly alluded to, with the online ad networks, is basically ripe for disruption.
Yeah, and so I find it, kind of fascinating that, we may be returning to a mode of advertising that more closely resembles the early days of radio, in the beginning of the 20th century, where you had product placement kind of woven into the shows. Like it sounds corny now to modern ears, but you'd have these household dramas where the husband would say, oh, honey, I'm so glad you picked up a box of something.
Yeah.
That if you're having a conversation with some AI, agent, whether it's Siri or Cortana or, take your pick, what will advertisement look like in that platform? It could be something as simple as, you ask it to order you some takeout, and it just suggests, oh, well, how about this place, right? Or do you want fries with that? That there are a lot of subtle ways that the business model can get its hooks into the interaction in a way that is potentially, more complicated or more problematic than what we see now on screen, where there's this clear visual delineation of this is an ad, it's over here.
Yeah. Now that's quite interesting, and what you said there about the whole honey example. And I'm sure you can program the AI to call you honey if you like, but essentially advertisers using the AI to promote their products. You get home from work late at night, say, hey, I'm a bit hungry. Well, what do you feel like? Oh, I wouldn't mind some pizza. And suddenly, Domino's or whoever's paying for the advertising is recommended as, the preferred vendor.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think we're going to start to treat our computers or, our technology more generally as a kind of butler, if you will, or a concierge service. And so, to me, it's quite fascinating to see exactly how this is going to end up playing out. But certainly, from the perspective of saying, I'm hungry, just order me something, I trust you. Like that act of just saying, make this decision for me on my behalf. Certainly there are a lot of companies, a lot of restaurants, for example, vying to be that just default choice for the person who doesn't feel like making a decision, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now that's a very interesting take on it. And I guess on that blurring of the lines between what is human and what is AI. At the Loebner Prize in 2008, obviously Albot, the AI chatbot back then, lost by I believe it was 1 vote, but he convinced 3 of the 12 human interrogators that he was indistinguishable from human, beating some of the other contestants in the process. And I guess ultimately Albert not only fooled the judges almost 30% of the time into believing that it was human, but its rivals, the humans, had failed almost 30% of the time to persuade judges that they were humans.
Well, that's precisely it. Yeah. When you said, appeared indistinguishable from humans, I was going to jump in and just say it's actually worse than that, which is that the judges typically have a pair of conversations at the same time, one with a computer and one with a human.
Wow.
So what it actually means is worse than being indistinguishable. Rather, the judges thought that it was the human and assumed that the real humans were the computer, which is doubly uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's quite scary. So, I mean, why do you think humanity lost out on this occasion?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, certainly in preparation for my own role as a Confederate at the Turing test, I went back over, 800 pages worth of transcripts from the Loebner Prize, going all the way back to 1992 when they started. And the failures, they're interesting because they all take different forms. I remember one in particular. There had been a Shakespeare expert on the panel one year, and her basic strategy was just that Shakespeare embodies all that is human. It's love and deceit and betrayal and passion, all these things. So she was just going to say as much about Shakespeare as possible, thinking that it was all sort of connected to this very deep human stuff. But her plan completely backfired, and in fact, if I recall correctly, all of the judges voted her a computer on the basis that no one knows that much about Shakespeare. There's no one who can just quote these passages verbatim and has this fully formed answer about every single play. So from her perspective as a Shakespeare scholar, she was very proud of the fact that she had been mistaken for a computer.
Does that say more about humans than it does about the AI?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, one of the complicated things about the Turing test as a standard. It lacks the kind of scientific objectivity that we might look for in a benchmark, because it's a test against a moving target, which is our own ability to communicate kind of richly and authentically with one another. And that's part of what made the subject so interesting for me, that, I set out to write what I thought would be a history of artificial intelligence and the Turing test, but it was also simultaneously a real study of human dialogue and human conversation.
That's an interesting take on it. And I guess, you've previously noted that the victory of the computer program Deep Blue over the Russian chess grandmaster, Garry Kasparov, basically affected a whole generation into thinking that the best way to, become grandmaster was through the memorization of famous matches. And it's interesting you raise that, because there's a lot of talk now going on in education circles, where it's said that, the education system hasn't really changed much since the dawn of the industrial age. And, students are still recognized by their ability to remember and regurgitate things in an exam situation. But in this age where you don't necessarily need to remember things, the information's there, it's one click away. Do you see this as a problem? And do you have any thoughts on where education should go in light of the developments of the last 10 to 15 years?
One of the most interesting reactions to the recent AI versus humanity contest on Jeopardy, where IBM's Watson supercomputer defeated Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter. Yeah. One of the most intriguing reactions to that event that I encountered was written by I believe it was the dean of the NYU Medical School. And he was saying, we're proud to take this occasion to announce NYU Medical School's partnership with IBM to use Watson technology to develop these diagnostic systems that are going to be better than humans can do. And what he said that really struck a chord with me was, as the dean of a medical school, this is an opportunity and a provocation to completely rethink what a medical education should look like. You know, that in the 21st century, and this has been true for many decades now, training to be a doctor involves huge amounts of hours spent just memorizing information. Yeah. You know, memorizing the names of every bone, every muscle, memorizing the countless numbers of drug interactions and so forth. And I think it's a very reasonable question to ask, if we have systems that can be much more up to date about all the different drug interactions and, never make a mistake or never forget something or never are unaware of some recent research that has just come out. Is it still a priority? If we only have 8 years or whatever to train a doctor, do we have an opportunity to change our priorities such that other things become more important, like the doctor-patient relationship, for example. And I think that's just one example. I mean, I certainly think that at the broader level, the progress in the field of AI is going to totally change the priorities that we have for what we feel like it's important for people to know, as a society. And, you can see things already dropping out of the curriculum, like cursive handwriting, for example, in the United States is getting pulled out of the curriculum because people are just saying, no one writes with pen and paper. It's just not necessary. And I was very fortunate that, even when I was growing up, typing skills were being taught at a very young age. And so, I've benefited from that my whole life. And then that's just a trivial example. I think more broadly, as you say, the existence of these systems that we can turn to effectively as external memory de-emphasize the importance of just remembering facts and I think make more important the kind of evaluative process of figuring out how to structure the kind of query we want to make to this system rather than just knowing the information ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, time is basically finite. And if you look back at the 20th century, we, from the industrial age through to the development of the car, the plane, essentially all these things made the world smaller, made doing things that could take months or years, take essentially hours or minutes in some cases, and basically gave us a lot of time back. And in the last 20 years with technology, we're essentially able to do a lot more than we were before, thanks to various advancements in that space. And it just seems crazy that when it comes to education, it's still very much sit down, consume this content, listen to the teacher. And I guess the same sort of fundamentals apply. It's like we've got the technology now whereby we don't necessarily need to spend 8 years remembering all this content. The content can be recalled for us by, an AI device or some sort of third-party system, and we should spend potentially that time learning how to deliver better outcomes and provide better patient care.
I think that's very much true. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess on delivering better care and the role that AI plays with that, you've written about some of the astonishing achievements as well as some of the equally fascinating failings of machines. What are some of these that stick out for you?
For me, just at the broadest level, I think it's a very exciting time to be alive from the perspective of these philosophical questions that have kind of hung over the human race since the very beginning. One of the oldest questions of all of philosophy is, what does it mean to be human? What is special and distinct and unique about the human species, human intelligence? And this is a question that goes back to Descartes, it goes back to Aristotle, and the traditional way within Western thought of addressing this question has been, let's compare ourselves to animals and think about the things that we can do that they can't. And so, you get Aristotle talking about how animals have desires, they have will, They can, form social attachments and all of these things. So he's just writing these things off. Like, okay, that can't be what the human experience is all about. Yeah. That can't be what the human experience is all about. And he concludes that, abstract, rational contemplation is the heart of the human experience, which I should add is an awfully convenient conclusion for a professional philosopher to draw. Yeah. And Descartes, in his way, I think, has a similar trajectory of discounting the sensory experience, discounting the bodily experience in favor of the kind of abstract logic of contemplation and rational argument making. So for me, the development of computers and AI, starting in the 40s up till today, has turned this 2,500-year-old question, one of the oldest questions in philosophy, totally on its head. Because what we're asking now, the very conversation you and I are having, and certainly the work of Turing, is motivated by the question not of what makes humans distinct from the animal kingdom, but what makes us distinct from machines.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And on philosophy, I was going to mention this a bit later and keen to hear your thoughts. You're probably very, very familiar with the fable of Socrates and Plato walking along the water, and Socrates, basically grabs Plato's head, ducks it in the water, he passes out, eventually he's resuscitated, and it's like, well, why did you do that? And it's like, well, when you want knowledge like you wanted air, then come and speak to me. Which, speaks volumes about philosophy, like meditation. It's often said that it's something that people can only truly seek out and appreciate when they've been through certain types of hardship. As such, some of the greatest philosophy available to man, in my opinion, it came from people who had broad life experiences and who experienced that hardship, such as, Marcus Aurelius and Meditations and, one of the great 5 Roman emperors. So I guess on that question that, you only discover meditation or philosophy once you really, really crave it or really have this innate need for it, is that something that's human, or is perhaps that something that can also fall into the remit of the machines?
I certainly think that I've been asked this question of what is it that makes humans unique and distinct and special, and one of the cheeky but I think true answers to that question is that we're currently the only thing in the universe that's anxious about our own uniqueness or our own place in the universe.
Yeah.
And I think the advent of AI, the computer in general, and then now as we sit kind of on the brink of this AI era, has created a kind of existential unease or an anxiety in the whole human species, because we're kind of confronted with not being the only intelligences in town, and so being forced to figure out, well, how do we learn to coexist in some sense with these other forms of intelligence, even if they're of our own making?
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a major project of the 21st century, is figuring out not only philosophically, but politically and economically, what is the role that we want to carve out for ourselves, especially as we move into this world in which, like I said, we're not the only game in town.
Yeah,
we're not the only intelligences in society.
And on coexisting, I think Peter Diamandis from Singularity University always, when he's asked the question about AI, he basically says, well, AI is going to be aiding human beings, and we will be coexisting, not necessarily, threatening the very existence of the human species.
Yeah, I take the caution or the concerns or the worries of people that are thinking about, existential risk, like, can AI wipe out our entire species?
Judgment Day, all that sort of stuff.
Judgment Day, exactly.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, probably 5 or 6 years ago, I thought of that stuff as crazy. And now I'm persuaded that those are things that are worth thinking about. Some of the smartest people in AI, Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, for example, who literally co-wrote, the AI Bible, the authoritative textbook on it. They're currently working on the 4th edition of the textbook, and it's going to have a hugely revised and updated section on, ethics, which was a topic that was by no means at the forefront of the field's mind, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I do think that, I think there are going to be basically phases of AI that are going to present their own challenges and their own risks. And so the kind of risks posed to us by this completely superhuman level intelligence that's, totally autonomous, totally, all powerful, or however people imagine it, that is a much farther stage. And so, frankly, I'm more concerned with making it to that stage than with the risks posed by getting to that stage. And so what I mean is, I think there's going to be an intermediate period of time where we develop AI that may not be superhuman level, it may not even be quite human level, but it will be good enough such that it will create, a political crisis, right? Tons of jobs becoming unnecessary, wealth being concentrated into the hands of the people who have, ownership over that technology. I think that's going to be a huge problem for governments to deal with in the next, let's say, 20, 25 years. I also think, one of the big problems with the development of AI is that it highlights the difficulty in articulating exactly what our goals and aspirations as a human race are. So let me give you an example. In most fields that involve some kind of concrete metric that you're trying to maximize, whether it's revenue or utility or whatever, there are always going to be these kinds of perverse conditions where the metric that you've supplied is getting maximized, but something horrible is happening on the side that you hadn't thought about. And so, within philosophy, there are these famous utilitarian paradoxes. There's one called the repugnant conclusion, which says, if you're a strict utilitarian and you say, okay, I want to maximize the sum total of all human happiness, well, then you can imagine a world in which there's 10 times as many people, but everyone's starving, and just because there's more people, well, there's more total utility in the world. So we should prefer that world to ours. And you think, well, okay, maybe that's not what I mean. Maybe what I mean is something like a utilitarian should maximize, mean human happiness, average happiness. And so you can come up with some perverse, example where, most people are very happy, but there's this tiny oppressed minority that's, tortured and miserable and having this horrible experience. But as long as it raises the mean happiness of the rest of the group, it's okay. And you think, well, that's not really what I mean either. So it turns out, to just be extremely hard to come up with some kind of formal metric for human flourishing that doesn't have some sort of, backfiring.
Opportunity cost or something like that.
Yeah. And I think that's going to be, and I would argue, honestly, that we're seeing the same thing right now with the climate, that, we've taken GDP to be the rough approximation of human flourishing, for lack of a better metric. And we've maximized it pretty well, but to our own peril. And so we have things like this huge negative externality of the climate, this huge problem of inequality, and all sorts of these things that are not captured by the thing that we set out to do. And I think that, these are, I'm obviously citing problems that already exist in the world as it is today. And I think that AI, because it's in the nature of, the paradigms that people use when they develop AI, that you have some kind of what's called objective function, and the system tries to maximize that objective function. I take it to be a pretty big problem that we still haven't figured out how to make objective functions that truly capture what we intuitively think of as being human flourishing. I think that's a huge unsolved problem.
Yeah, you've touched on quite a few interesting points there. One that I wanted to dig a little bit deeper on is what you mentioned a little bit earlier around the political impact of AI and the loss of jobs. And I think there's been research that suggests that about 50% of today's jobs are likely to be replaced in the next 10 to 15 years or automated, amongst other things such as being offshored, et cetera, et cetera. So, yet we're still churning out people to fulfill traditional roles, whether they be accountant, lawyer, doctor, et cetera, engineer, many of which will be automated to some degree. And when we draw parallels to, say, 2016 to the early 20th century, when 80% of the American population were farmers, today the number is 2%. So people adapt. So what role do you think we have to play in terms of preparing people for these changes?
It's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that I am a little bit haunted by when I think about this is there's the famous quote, I want to say it's by John Maynard Keynes, if I'm remembering this correctly, basically to the effect that, by approximately now-ish, we'll have enough technology that no one really needs to work very hard and everything's going to be kind of handed to us. And as we know, that didn't quite happen like that. And I think a field that has been very influential in my own thinking is game theory. And one of the things in game theory is that, there are situations in which it's very hard to raise the objective standard of everyone if there's some kind of zero-sum component. So, I'm thinking, for example, of if there's a limited amount of housing available in a city, then the price of that housing will basically be kind of elastic relative to the spending power of the people, because people need a house, and so they need to make enough money to buy a house in that area. But because they're competing against other people, then really it comes down to they need to be making more money than other people. And so, the Nash equilibrium of this game is that everyone is working as hard as they can all the time.
Yeah.
And so the question for me is, politically, how do we as a society think about ways to avoid those sorts of bad equilibria in a time in which our basic needs are otherwise provided for? Like, I don't want to live in a world in which we are forced by these sort of bad game theoretic scenarios to work just for the sake of having worked slightly harder than the next guy, right? Yeah. Because that's a world in which you're never able to realize those gains. And so that to me is an open question. I don't claim to have an all-encompassing theory of what that looks like. But I think it's never been more important to be asking that question of how do we actually stand to reap and savor the rewards of that technology rather than simply moving our efforts toward ever more zero-sum things. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess, that may be a broader, more human question. Going back to philosophers like Seneca, one of the great Stoic philosophers, who basically said that a rich man is a man who has everything that is necessary, everything that is enough. And that's basically not driven by external things. And he basically went on to say that a poor man is a man who never has enough. He may have the car, the house, the bank account, all of that stuff, but he always wants more, and therefore he's a poor man because he's never content. So is that a broader human question as opposed to a question of our economic realities? Yeah, I think it's both. It's very much both. I think there's first of all a question of as a society we can decide where we want to draw the line between amount of work performed and standard of living. Like we certainly have better dental care, right, than people did at the beginning of the 20th century.
Correct.
But if you think about it, I mean, one of the thought experiments I sometimes tell people when it comes to, thinking about the advantages of conferred by technology is, were the lives of people 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, were they substantially less happy than the average people are today? And most people that I ask this question say, probably it's about the same. Like they cared about their friendships, their romances, their family, their community, that kind of thing. Yeah. And to the extent that those are kind of the perennial key things, then, going back to the Keynes thing, it's like we can continue to work the same amount or ever harder for this higher standard of living, more exquisite goods or, what have you. Or we can say, let's maintain the same standard of living and work ever less. And I don't know, it doesn't seem to me like very many cultures in the world at the moment are making the trade-off in that direction. Yeah. But I think the question is going to become kind of naggingly and persistently relevant, especially once we, as you say, move into this situation where a lot of the jobs that are currently comprising the economy can be automated.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and I think it's all relative to a significant degree. I mean, going back to, say, the Renaissance, no doubt people's lifespans were much shorter. 30 to 40 was pretty much standard. There wasn't necessarily clean drinking water, lighting. Right. I think there was this great stat about light. 200 odd years ago, it required 6 hours of manual labor to buy 1 hour of light, whereas today it's about literally seconds to buy the same hour, right? So things like that, but it's all relative. I mean, back then that would have been the norm. So you would have been none the wiser as to wanting a more fulfilling or let's say a more comfortable life, because that was the norm. I mean, someone living in poverty today has it much better than what King Louis or King Henry or any one of the great English kings had it only several hundred years ago.
I mean, I think it's there's a sense in which that's true, and there's another sense in which a lot of the things that people care about emotionally are relative to are a product of their relative status. And so, even if the king has really bad dental hygiene, he still gets paid respect by everyone that he sees in a way that someone living in poverty now does not. Does not. And so I think, it's interesting, right? Because there are a combination of these things that are an objective product of like the technological standard or the standard of living. And then there are these other more relative factors that are kind of a function of the structure of society, and those end up being, I think, more persistent.
That's an interesting take on it, and I definitely agree. It is comes back to a lot of those Maslow's hierarchy of needs questions, right? And you mentioned earlier that humans are in the unique position of being anxious about their uniqueness in the world. And behavioral economists have concluded that humans are irrational and error-prone, owing in large part to the buggy, idiosyncratic hardware of the brain. And your latest book, co-written with Tom Griffiths, suggests that thinking algorithmically about the world, learning about the fundamental structures of the problems we face and about the properties of their solutions, can help us see how good we actually are and better understand the errors that we make.
Yeah. So, as you say, my first book, The Most Human, is asking these questions from the vantage of what are we learning about the human condition from the attempts to build machines in our own image. And the new book, which is called Algorithms to Live By, a collaboration between myself and Tom Griffiths, asks the question in almost the reverse direction, which is what have we learned about the human experience and human decision making from the parallels between the problems that we solve in our everyday lives and the fundamental problems of computer science. And as you say, I think one of the really significant overarching insights that comes out of thinking in computational terms about human decision-making is that the field of computer science teaches us that there are huge classes of problems that are simply what's called intractable. or NP hard is the term used in the field. And the idea here is that if you're trying to think your way through a situation, you simply do not have the luxury to consider all options, think everything through all the way to the end, and arrive at a solution that is, precise and certain. That just isn't possible when you're dealing with an intractable problem.
Right.
And, moreover, having a supercomputer at your side to crunch through those possibilities with you will not help, because the problem is just, beyond that capacity. And so this, I think, gives us a way of thinking in radically new terms about the idea of rationality itself. As you say, there's been a narrative in the popular press that's been really sort of anti-human. Here are all the dumb things we do.
Yep.
These are the mistakes that we make, and so forth. These are the kind of shortcuts and heuristics that we use. And I think there's a subtler story there, which is that when you're up against a hard enough problem, you cannot calculate everything all the way through to the end and consider every possible option and so forth, and nor would a computer. And so in the book, we explore strategies like, using randomness, using approximations, relaxing the problem so you soften some of the constraints and solve kind of an easier version before bringing it back to reality. Things like this that look a lot more like what we humans do when we're up against a hard problem, right? We only consider a subset of our options. We turn to chance in some cases, literally flipping a coin. We use approximation. We're willing to take a solution that we're only mostly confident in. There are a lot of great examples of this, even within computer science itself. In internet encryption, one of the fundamental things you need to do in order to encrypt website traffic, to your bank, let's say, is the computer needs to generate this enormous prime number. And it just so happens that the best algorithm that we have for checking whether a number is prime is wrong 25% of the time. And so as a society, we've just decided, well, let's run that algorithm 40 times, and it's just going to be wrong 1/4 to the 40th power times, which is like 1 in every million billion, and that's close enough, and that's considered a standard practice in the banking industry and so forth. And so these sorts of trade-offs where we're willing to only be almost certain of something in a fraction of the time, rather than spending all the time in the world to arrive at total certainty. I think the real takeaway here is these sorts of things are not concessions that one makes when one can't be rational. Up against a hard enough problem, they are what it means to be rational.
And I guess to that extent, talking about solving problems, humans have this difficulty when they're presented with lots of different options to actually choose from one. Dating is a classic example, particularly people who are dating in big cities like NYC. It's always that question of, can I find someone better?
Right.
Because every day you're walking past hundreds, if not thousands of people. So you've talked about something called the 37% rule, or optimal stopping. Do you want to elaborate on this rule?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so dating has this very particular structure where when you're in a relationship, you have a decision to make, which is you either stay with that person and commit to them and you never know what else might have been out there, or you break it off and walk away, but you're probably forfeiting the opportunity to change your mind later and go back to that person. And so there's this very particular anxiety that people sometimes have, which is, how do I know? How do I know if this is the right person for me? How do I know what else might be out there? And the very act of gathering information about that might cost you your best match. And so this corresponds to a field in mathematics that's called optimal stopping, and it deals with problems that have exactly this structure. The most famous is called the secretary problem, and the basic idea is you're trying to hire a secretary, and N candidates show up at at the office in random order, and you interview them one at a time. And then, similar to dating, as you interview each one, you either hire them on the spot and send everyone else home, or you dismiss them, but you lose the chance to call them back and change your mind. And so what can you do if your goal is to try to find the very best person out there? Intuitively, I think we would have a sense that, it involves a combination of looking and leaping. A little bit of a period of just sort of evaluation to kind of set a benchmark, set a standard, followed by a willingness to, go all in and commit to something that meets that standard. And this turns out to be exactly right. But our intuition alone doesn't tell us what the balance should be. And in the classic version of the problem, there is this wonderfully succinct solution, which is 37%. Spend exactly 37% of the search non-committally exploring your options. And after that point, be prepared to immediately commit to the first person you see who's better than the people you met in that first 37%.
Yeah. So basically, if I've got 100 days to find someone, I spend 37 days looking, and the next person I meet who is better than anyone I met in those first 37 days, I should settle for. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. Yes.
Okay.
And this is the provably optimal solution from the perspective of giving you the very best chance at ending up with the very best person.
It's very interesting. And this rule essentially applies to anything. It could be searching for an apartment, searching for a parking space, and so on.
Yeah, that's right. So looking for an apartment, I think it maps extremely analogously to the secretary problem, to the dating problem. If you're in a competitive enough environment, New York City being the example, the Bay Area, where I live, being another example, you have the same structure that you have with dating, which is, you go to an open house, and you have to decide on the spot, do I want to commit to this place, or do I want to walk away knowing that surely someone else will have gotten the place before I can change my mind? And so the 37% rule is just as applicable there. Now, parking is a slightly modified version of the problem where you are trying to minimize the total distance that you end up walking. And so, in the book, Tom and I provide some handy charts that you can actually print out and paste on your dashboard that tell you exactly how many spaces away you should be willing to take the first space that pops up.
Wow. Interesting. And I guess to take this on a slight tangent, when it comes to AI, and I know you've got a background in poetry, Brian, when it comes to art and creativity, Zachary Scholl, a computational biology scholar, basically created a poem using AI that passed the Turing test. And Melomic's technology basically developed AI that is capable of composing music, and in fact, it's created over 1 billion songs across the gamut of genres. What's your take on computer-generated art?
I think it's a great. It's just as it is with philosophy, and it's forcing us to ask these questions about what exactly is art, what makes something art, and I think AI is having this wonderful effect of making those questions, in some cases, uncomfortably acute. So, I mean, my personal read on this is that I think this kind of comes back to our earlier conversation about what one's goals are, or what one's so-called objective function is. I think within any artistic discipline, there are people who master a style, and there are people who kind of disrupt the very criteria by which art gets evaluated. So, I mean, certainly the 20th century had a number of great artists that had this kind of disruptive effect. Marcel Duchamp putting a toilet in an art gallery is a great example. But even going further back to the 19th century, composers like Beethoven using the dominant seventh chord, which people at the time thought was just sort of grotesque and dissonant. It really feels to me that these great breakthrough moments in art come as a result of someone not mastering the game, but changing the rules by which they want the game to be played.
I guess that's kind of the same as the theory of disruptive innovation, but applied to art. It's not so much a matter of just doing what everyone else has done, and like you've alluded to there, the nature by which art is evaluated can be somewhat questionable. I mean, oftentimes it's based on what commercial value can we actually generate but on the back of this music, for example.
Right. And so that, to me, I mean, writing music for that, for commercial intent, for me, in my view, is just of a lower order than the kind of art that exists. In my opinion, the highest quality of art, or the highest echelon of art, is art that exists because the creator has some kind of agenda. They want to put a dent in the universe, is how Steve Jobs put it. But they want to leave some kind of mark. They want to alter the landscape of society or of the art practice. And from that point of view, I find it hard to imagine that computer-generated music, it's easy for me to imagine that computer-generated music could be very beautiful or very interesting or very captivating. It's harder for me to imagine that it could have an agenda in the way that I think the greatest art has a mind behind it that wants to do something by way of that art.
Yeah.
I'm not sold on the value of AI generated music, not because I don't think it has the ability to be as complex and competent, but because I think it lacks the agenda that for me is part of the satisfying thing about it.
Yeah, look, I'm a big believer that great ideas, whether it's for the purposes of innovating within a company, or whether it's creating music or penning new poems, is usually done from a place of flow. When those alpha and theta brainwaves come together, and essentially, unless computers can get into flow, I don't see any great artwork coming out of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we'll probably get down to the final 3 questions, which is a bit of fun I like to have with all of my guests. So I ask 2 hypotheticals and 1 on lifestyle design. So the first question, Brian, is if you could work for any company at any stage of their company life cycle, who would it be and why?
That's a great question. The first company that jumps to my mind is Tesla.
Yep.
I'm extremely passionate about renewable energy, and I think that the sheer ambition of that company, coupled with just the incredible both the work ethic and the standard to which they hold themselves, and just the sheer gutsiness of trying to come in and disrupt something like the car industry, and accelerate the transition to sustainable energy. To me, that's it's both exciting. It makes me excited for the next 10 years in a way that Moore's Law made me excited for the 90s and the 2000s. I think energy is the thing to be excited about in the next 15 years.
Yeah.
And I think, so that's my choice.
Yeah, and it's a great choice, I mean, that's one of the things I often say, with technology changing as much as it is, with AI, the risk of teaching future generations the same stuff they've always learned means we're going to be churning out less people who think like Elon Musk, who want to take those moonshots and revolutionize transport, energy, space travel, and so on. I think we need more people like that, and as opposed to people who just execute set procedure, which is something that computers can do for us.
Absolutely, yeah. This goes back to our conversation about art, right? The agenda. He's a guy who's very much got an agenda. He's got something he wants to do to the world, and I totally respect that.
Yeah, fantastic. And question number 2 is: if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be, and what would you ask?
That's a great question. I mean, I would love to think about this for, hours and get back to you.
Yeah.
One of the people who comes to my mind is Bertrand Russell. I think of Bertrand Russell as just an absolutely fascinating mind. He's one of those people who, in his philosophical work, had this incredible rigor. His Principia Mathematica is this attempt to formalize, all of mathematics. And yet, at the same time, he was also this great humanist and this essayist who wrote about, pacifism and politics and culture, with just this throbbing, warmth and this spiritedness. And I mean, frankly, I was astonished when I realized that the guy who wrote the Principia Mathematica and the guy who wrote all these essays, it didn't compute for me that it could be the same person, because just the quality of mind in those two endeavors is so different. So I don't know if there's a single question that I'd want to ask him, but I would love to see his mind in action, because just the way he's able to fuse that extreme rigor with that extreme warmth and humanity, to me, that's really remarkable.
And I think future generations may be saying the same thing about a guy like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs, saying, I can't believe the same guy did all these things.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And finally, Brian, one question I like to ask is on lifestyle design. So other than using computer algorithms to hack your life and make better decisions, what do you do to stay on top of your game?
I mean, certainly having just, published a book called Algorithms to Live By, I've been very influenced by my work to think computationally about my own life. So one of the domains that we get into in the book is called the explore-exploit dilemma, which asks, when should I try new things and when should I stick with what I know and love? And so this is an area where I find myself explicitly appealing to the explore-exploit dilemma and various explore-exploit algorithms that I'm familiar with when I make these everyday sorts of decisions, like, do I try a new restaurant that just opened up, or do I just go to my favorite place? One of the overarching principles in this space in computer science is that it kind of depends how much time you feel that you have to spend. And so the more time you have to spend in a city, for example, the more willing you should be to try new places. Because if you make a great discovery, you can keep coming back. And so for me, I just got engaged. And my fiance lives in Oakland, and she's moving in with me in San Francisco. And so as a result, we feel that our time in Oakland is scarce, and our time in San Francisco is just beginning. And so, correspondingly, the computer science tells us we should be exploiting in Oakland. We should be spending most of our time going back to our favorite places, and we should be really open to trying new places here in San Francisco. And so it's probably close to what I would be doing intuitively anyway, but I have this language that comes from computer science. And so, that has become a way that I think about, lifestyle design questions in my own life. Fantastic.
No, that's a great answer, and I think audience can take a lot out of that. Actually reminds me of a post I saw on Medium recently. The author, unfortunately, the name escapes me, but I'll be sure to include it in our show notes. And he basically mapped out how many days you have to spend with certain people in your life, and it was a graphical representation. So basically using little stick figures. And it could be a case of where you spent maybe 95% of the time that you will spend with, say, a parent.
Yes,
because
I've seen this. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, because obviously you grew up in the same house, so you would have spent 7 days a week with them, but now you maybe see them once a week, once a month, once a year, and therefore you've probably spent 95, if not 99% of the time that you're going to spend on Earth with them, and therefore you should try and optimize that time when you're with them.
I think that's a profound reminder of kind of where we stand in relationship to the various intervals of time that we have in our own life. And I think it's very much worth being mindful of that. Absolutely.
Definitely. So, Brian, the most human and algorithms to live by, people can pick those up at the usual suspects, Amazon, Google Play, etc., etc.?
Yep, you got it.
Fantastic.
Anywhere books are sold.
Yep, and to find out a little bit more about yourself, brian-christian.com would be the best place to go?
Yeah, that's it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time, Brian. You've been a wonderful guest, and I'm sure
it's my pleasure.
And I'm sure our audience will be left with a lot of food for thought. So thank you again.
Good. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that fascinating chat with Brian Christian on AI and what it means to be human in the 21st century. To subscribe to this podcast, you can do so on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. We'd also love it if you took just a second to like and share the podcast if you are that way inclined. We've also recently just released the Innovation Managers online course, which you can check out at innovationmanagerscourse.com. For more on Collective Campus, head to collectivecamp.us. Until next time, Future Squared out.